Chapter 1, September 1849. The Escape That Changed History. On the night of September 17, 1849, Araminta Ross stood at the edge of the Poplar Neck Plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland, and made a decision that would alter the course of American history. She was 27 years old. She had been enslaved since birth. She had a husband, who was a free man, but refused to leave Maryland. She had a mother, father, and 8 siblings, scattered across plantations throughout the eastern shore. She had been beaten so severely as a child that she suffered seizures and vivid dreams for the rest of her life. And now she had heard the news that would force her to act. Her master, Edward Brodess, had died on March 7th of that year. His widow, Eliza, was selling off enslaved people to pay debts. Araminta had already watched 3 of her sisters dragged away in chains and sold to plantations in the Deep South, where conditions were so brutal that most enslaved people died within 7 years. She would not let that happen to her. She would not let that happen to her brothers. She was going to run. She had tried once before, earlier that week, convincing her brothers Ben and Harry to escape with her. They had made it 6 miles north before Ben and Harry panicked and turned back, terrified of the slave catchers, the dogs, the punishment if they were caught. Araminta had walked them home to ensure they were safe, but she had not given up. She had simply decided to go alone. That night, she walked into the small cabin she shared with her husband, John Tubman, and told him she was leaving. He told her she was crazy. He told her she would be caught. He told her that if she tried to escape, he would report her to their mistress. Araminta stared at the man she had married 5 years earlier and realized he would never understand. Freedom was more important than marriage. Freedom was more important than safety. Freedom was the only thing that mattered. She did not argue with him. She did not try to change his mind. She simply turned around, walked out of the cabin, and disappeared into the darkness. She would never see John Tubman again. Years later, she would learn that he had remarried another woman almost immediately after her escape. She never spoke his name again. The route north was approximately 90 miles from Dorchester County to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the nearest free state. Araminta did not have a map. She did not know exactly where Philadelphia was. She knew only that freedom lay north and that she had to follow the North Star. She also knew something else, something she had learned through whispered conversations with other enslaved people over the years. There was a network, a secret system of safe houses, hidden routes, and courageous people who helped fugitives escape. They called it the Underground Railroad, though it was neither underground nor a railroad. It was simply a network of abolitionists, free black people, and sympathetic white Quakers who believed slavery was a sin and were willing to risk their own freedom to help others find theirs. Araminta had been given a name, a white woman who lived near the plantation. A Quaker. The woman had once whispered to Araminta that if she ever needed help, she should come to her door after dark. Araminta had memorized the location. Now, walking through the forest in the middle of the night, she found the house. She knocked softly on the door. The woman answered. She did not look surprised. She did not ask questions. She simply pulled Araminta inside, gave her food, and told her to rest for a few hours. At dawn, the woman gave Araminta a piece of paper with 2 names written on it and directions to the next safe house, about 15 miles north. She told Araminta to travel only at night, to stay off the roads, to trust no one except the people whose names were on the paper. Then she gave Araminta a broom and told her to sweep the yard. If anyone asked, Araminta was simply a hired girl doing chores. When darkness fell again, Araminta left the house and continued north. She walked through forests. She waded through rivers to throw off the scent of tracking dogs. She hid in barns during the day and traveled by night. She followed the North Star. She did not know how many days it took. Later, she would say it felt like weeks, though historians estimate it was probably between 7 and 10 days. What she did know, what she would remember for the rest of her life, was the moment she crossed the border into Pennsylvania. She described it years later to her biographer, Sarah Bradford. She said that when she realized she had crossed into free territory, she looked at her hands to see if she was the same person. The sun was rising, the sky was golden, everything looked different. She said, "There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." But the joy was immediately followed by a crushing realization. She was free, but everyone she loved was still enslaved. Her mother, her father, her brothers, her sisters, her nieces and nephews. She was standing in Pennsylvania, breathing free air for the first time in her life, and all she could think about was the people she had left behind. She later told Bradford, "I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and friends were there. But I was free, and they should be free." Philadelphia in 1849 was a city of contradictions. It was the birthplace of American democracy, the city where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 73 years earlier, with its famous words, "All men are created equal." It was also a city where escaped slaves lived in constant fear of being kidnapped and returned to the South under the Fugitive Slave Act. That law, which had been passed in 1793 and would be strengthened in 1850, made it legal for slave catchers to pursue fugitives into free states, capture them, and drag them back into slavery. Free black people were also in danger. Slave catchers often kidnapped free black people and claimed they were escaped slaves. There were no trials, no appeals. If a white man swore that a black person was his property, that was considered sufficient evidence. Philadelphia had a large free black community and a strong abolitionist movement, but it was not truly safe. Araminta understood this. She understood that her freedom was fragile, but she also understood that she had skills. She was strong. She could work. She found employment as a domestic worker in hotels and private homes. She saved every penny she earned, and she began making connections within the abolitionist community. She met William Still, a free black man who worked for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, and who would later become known as the father of the Underground Railroad. Still kept meticulous records of every fugitive slave who passed through Philadelphia, documenting their stories so that families might someday be reunited. He recorded Araminta's arrival. She also met members of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, an organization dedicated to helping fugitive slaves find housing, employment, and protection. She attended meetings at Mother Bethel AME Church, the oldest African Methodist Episcopal church in the United States, where fugitive slaves gathered to hear news and share information. And she made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. Less than a year after escaping slavery herself, She announced that she was going back to Maryland to rescue her family. People told her she was insane. They told her that going back into slave territory was suicide. They told her that she had barely escaped with her own life, and now she wanted to risk everything to go back. She listened to all of their objections. Then she said, "I will bring my people out or die trying." In December 1850, she returned to Maryland for the first time. Her target was her niece, Keziah Jolly Boley, who was about to be sold at auction in Cambridge, Maryland, along with Keziah's 2 young children. The plan was audacious. Keziah's husband, John Boley, who was a free black man, attended the auction. When the bidding started, he signaled to Keziah to slip away with the children during the confusion. They hid in a safe house until nightfall. Then Araminta, who had been waiting nearby, guided them north to Baltimore, where they boarded a ship to Philadelphia. The entire operation took 3 days. It was a complete success. No one was caught, no one was injured, and 3 more people were free. That rescue established a pattern that would repeat itself over the next decade. Between 1850 and 1860, Araminta, who had now taken the name Harriet in honor of her mother and adopted her husband's surname Tubman to create a new identity, would return to Maryland approximately 13 times. She would rescue roughly 70 people, including her parents, several of her brothers, and numerous friends and extended family members. She developed a system. She always traveled in winter when the nights were longest. She always left on Saturday nights because newspaper advertisements for runaway slaves could not be published until Monday, giving her a 48-hour head start. She carried a pistol, not to shoot slave catchers, but to threaten anyone in her group who wanted to turn back. She knew that anyone who turned back could be captured and tortured into revealing her roots and contacts. She would put the gun to their head and say, "You will be free or die a slave." She used songs as signals. When she arrived near a plantation, she would sing spirituals that had coded messages. "Go down, Moses" meant it was time to escape. "Wade in the water" meant to walk through streams to avoid tracking dogs. "Follow the drinking gourd" meant to follow the North Star, which was part of the constellation known as the Big Dipper, or drinking gourd. Enslaved people who heard her songs knew it was Harriet Tubman, and they knew it was time to run. She became legendary. Enslaved people called her Moses, after the biblical prophet who led the Hebrews out of Egypt. White abolitionists called her General Tubman because of her military precision and discipline. Slave owners called her a criminal and a thief. An advertisement offering a reward for her capture was published in 1849, though historians have found no evidence of the $40,000 bounty that later became part of her legend. The actual reward was likely around $300, still a substantial sum in 1850s currency, enough to motivate every slave catcher on the eastern shore to hunt for her. But Harriet was never caught, not once in 13 trips, not once in 70 rescues. She later said, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." She credited her success to God. She was deeply religious, and she believed that God gave her visions that warned her of danger. These visions were likely related to the traumatic brain injury she had suffered as a child when an overseer threw a 2-pound weight at another slave and hit Harriet in the head instead. The injury caused her to have sudden sleeping spells and vivid dreams for the rest of her life. But Harriet interpreted these experiences as divine guidance. When she felt a premonition of danger, she would change routes. When she dreamed of a specific path, she would follow it. Her faith gave her courage. It gave her the certainty that what she was doing was right, and it gave her the strength to keep going back, trip after trip, year after year, even as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made her work infinitely more dangerous. That law changed everything. It required citizens of free states to assist in the capture of fugitive slaves. It imposed heavy fines on anyone who helped slaves escape. It allowed slave catchers to operate in northern states with impunity. It meant that Philadelphia was no longer safe. Harriet began routing her groups farther north, into New York, and sometimes all the way to Canada, where slavery had been abolished in 1834. The journeys became longer. The risks became greater. But Harriet did not stop. By 1860, she had become the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass, the most prominent black abolitionist in America, wrote of her, "Excepting John Brown, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people." John Brown himself, the radical abolitionist who would later lead the raid on Harper's Ferry, called her General Tubman and consulted with her about his plans. William Still recorded in his journal that Harriet Tubman was one of the most remarkable women of this or any age. But Harriet herself remained humble. She did not consider herself a hero. She considered herself a servant of God, doing what needed to be done. She lived frugally, saving her money not for herself, but to fund more rescue missions. She slept in churches and safe houses. She worked when she needed money and traveled when she had enough saved. Her entire life was dedicated to one purpose: bringing her people out of slavery. By early 1861, she had rescued everyone in her immediate family who wanted to leave. Her parents were living in Auburn, New York, in a house that Harriet had purchased for them. Her brothers were free. Her nieces and nephews were free. The 70 people she had personally guided to freedom had gone on to have children, who would have children, creating generations who would live in freedom because of her courage. She had done what she set out to do. She had brought her people out. And then, in April 1861, everything changed. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War began, and Harriet Tubman found herself facing a new question. The Underground Railroad had been about saving individuals, one family at a time, but now there was an opportunity to save everyone, to end slavery itself. And Harriet Tubman was about to discover that the skills she had developed as a conductor on the Underground Railroad were exactly the skills the Union Army needed to win the war. In May 1862, Harriet Tubman stepped off a steamship at Port Royal, South Carolina, and walked into a war zone. She was 40 years old. She had spent the previous year and a half in Boston and Auburn, New York, helping her parents settle into their new home and preparing for what she believed would be the final chapter in the fight against slavery. When news reached her that the Union Army had captured Port Royal and the surrounding sea islands, creating a massive refugee crisis as thousands of formerly enslaved people fled to Union lines, she knew exactly what she had to do. Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts, who was organizing the first official regiments of black soldiers in United States history, had personally recruited her. He told her that the Union Army desperately needed people who understood the South, who could communicate with the newly freed slaves, who could navigate the treacherous marshlands and swamps of the Low Country. He told her, that her experience with the Underground Railroad made her uniquely qualified. What he did not tell her, what she would discover only after she arrived, was that the Union Army had no idea what to do with a woman who had more military experience than most of their officers. Port Royal in 1862 was chaos. The Union Navy had captured the harbor and surrounding islands in November 1861 in one of the earliest Union victories of the war. White plantation owners had fled, abandoning approximately 10,000 enslaved people on the islands. The Union Army suddenly found itself responsible for feeding, housing, and protecting thousands of people who had never been free, who had no money, no possessions, no education, and who were terrified that the Confederates would return and re-enslave them. The Army set up contraband camps, temporary settlements where the freed people could live while the military figured out what to do with them. Conditions were terrible. Disease was rampant. Smallpox, dysentery, typhoid fever, and malaria killed dozens of people every week. The Army doctors were overwhelmed. Most of them had never treated black patients before and had little understanding of the tropical diseases that thrived in the low-country heat and humidity. When Harriet arrived, she was immediately assigned to work as a nurse. The Army assumed that because she was a black woman, nursing was the appropriate role for her. They were not entirely wrong. She did have nursing skills, but they had no idea what else she was capable of. Harriet spent her first 3 months in South Carolina working in the contraband camps and military hospitals. She cared for sick soldiers and newly freed people. She had learned herbal medicine from her mother, who had been a folk healer on the Maryland plantations. She brewed remedies from local plants, using roots and leaves to treat dysentery and fevers when the Army's limited medical supplies ran out. She became known for her ability to cure patients whom the doctors had given up on. One Union officer later wrote that Harriet Tubman's remedies were more effective than anything the Army surgeons had in their medical kits. But nursing was not what Harriet had come to South Carolina to do. She had come to fight. And she knew that the real war was not in the hospitals. It was in the swamps and plantations where Confederate forces still controlled the interior of South Carolina, where thousands of enslaved people were still trapped, and where the Union Army had almost no intelligence about enemy movements, fortifications, or supply lines. In late summer 1862, Harriet approached General David Hunter, the commander of Union forces in the Department of the South. Hunter was a controversial figure. He had issued an order in May 1862 declaring all slaves in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to be free, but President Lincoln had overruled him, fearing that the order would push border states into the Confederacy. Hunter was frustrated. He believed the Union could not win the war without black soldiers and without destroying the plantation system that sustained the Confederate economy. He also believed that the Union Army was operating blind in South Carolina. His officers had maps, but the maps were often inaccurate. They had no local intelligence. They did not know where Confederate troops were stationed. They did not know which rivers were mined. They did not know which plantation owners were secretly supplying the Confederate Army. When Harriet Tubman walked into his office and told him she could provide that intelligence, he listened. Harriet told Hunter that she had spent 10 years moving through hostile territory without being caught. She told him that enslaved people on the plantations knew everything about Confederate movements, supply routes, and fortifications. But they would not share that information with white Union soldiers. They would share it with her. Hunter asked her how she could be sure. Harriet explained that enslaved people in the South knew who she was. They knew about the Underground Railroad. They knew about Moses. They trusted her. If she went into the swamps and plantations, they would talk to her. They would tell her what the Union Army needed to know. Hunter made a decision that was almost unheard of in 1862. He authorized Harriet Tubman to organize a network of scouts behind enemy lines. He gave her access to what was called Secret Service money, a fund used to pay spies and informants. He told her to recruit whoever she needed and to report directly to him and to Colonel James Montgomery, who commanded the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, one of the first regiments of black soldiers in the Union Army. Harriet went to work immediately. She recruited 9 men, all of them formerly enslaved, all of them intimately familiar with the rivers, swamps, and plantations of the Low Country. Several of them had been riverboat pilots before the war. They knew every bend in the Combahee River, every sandbar in the Ashpoo, every hidden channel in the marshes. Harriet trained them in techniques she had developed during her years on the Underground Railroad. How to move silently through enemy territory. How to gather information without arousing suspicion. How to use songs and signals to communicate with enslaved people on plantations. How to map terrain and fortifications. The Scouts became known as Tubman's Corps, and they were extraordinarily effective. Between September 1862 and May 1863, they conducted dozens of reconnaissance missions deep into Confederate-held territory. They identified the locations of Confederate picket posts, ammunition depots, and supply warehouses. They mapped minefields in the rivers. They documented which plantations were actively supplying food and cotton to the Confederate Army. And they made contact with enslaved people on every plantation along the coast, creating a network of informants who fed intelligence to the Union Army. The information Harriet's scouts provided was crucial to several Union operations. In March 1863, they gathered intelligence that enabled Colonel Montgomery to lead a raid on Jacksonville, Florida, temporarily capturing the city and destroying Confederate supplies. But the Scouts' most important work was yet to come. By May 1863, Union commanders in South Carolina were planning a major operation up the Combahee River. The goal was to destroy the plantations that were providing rice and other supplies to the Confederate Army, to disrupt the local economy, and to liberate as many enslaved people as possible, both as a humanitarian mission and as a way to recruit more soldiers for the black regiments. The operation required precise intelligence. The Combahee River was heavily mined. Confederate sentries were posted along the banks. The plantations were fortified. One mistake could result in a disaster. Colonel Montgomery asked Harriet if her scouts could provide the intelligence needed to make the raid succeed. Harriet said yes. She said more than that. She said she would personally lead the scouting mission and guide the gunboats up the river. For 2 weeks in May 1863, Harriet and her scouts moved through the swamps along the Combahee River. They traveled at night, wading through waist-deep water infested with snakes and alligators. They made contact with enslaved people on the plantations, whispering conversations in the darkness, learning where the Confederate sentries were stationed, where the mines were placed in the river, where supplies were stored, where the best landing points were for Union troops. They mapped everything. Harriet drew detailed sketches showing the locations of docks, bridges, rice mills, storehouses, and plantation houses. She documented which plantations had the most enslaved people and where those people were likely to be at different times of day. She identified escape routes and rally points. When she returned to Port Royal on May 31st, she handed Colonel Montgomery a complete operational plan. She told him exactly where to land his troops, exactly which targets to hit, exactly how to avoid the mines, and exactly how to evacuate with the maximum number of freed slaves. Montgomery looked at the plan and asked Harriet if she would come on the raid, not as a scout observing from a distance, but as a guide on the lead gunboat, directing the operation in real time. Harriet agreed. On the night of June 1, 1863, 3 Union gunboats, the John Adams, the Harriet A. Weed, and the Sentinel, began moving up the Combahee River. On board were approximately 300 soldiers from the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, all of them black men, many of them formerly enslaved, and all of them about to participate in one of the most successful raids of the Civil War. Standing on the deck of the John Adams, next to Colonel Montgomery, was Harriet Tubman. She was the only woman on the raid. She was unarmed, carrying no weapon except her knowledge of the river and the trust of the people they were coming to liberate. As the gunboats moved slowly upstream in the darkness, Harriet stood at the bow and directed the pilot. She pointed out sandbars. She identified the locations of submerged mines and guided the boats safely past them. Confederate sentries on the shore heard the engines, but could not see the boats in the darkness. Some fired shots blindly into the night. The bullets splashed harmlessly into the water. The gunboats kept moving. At approximately 2 in the morning, the boats reached the first target, a plantation called Middleton Place. Soldiers disembarked and quickly overwhelmed the few Confederate sentries. They set fire to the plantation house, the rice mill, and the storehouses. Explosions lit up the night as they destroyed bridges to prevent Confederate reinforcements from arriving. And then Harriet did something that no one expected. She began to sing. It was a spiritual, one of the coded songs she had used on the Underground Railroad. The melody carried across the plantation. Enslaved people in the quarters heard it. They recognized the voice. They recognized the song. And they knew what it meant. Moses had come. It was time to run. Within minutes, people began emerging from the slave quarters and running toward the river. Some carried children. Some carried bundles of possessions. Some carried nothing at all. They ran toward the gunboats, toward freedom, toward the woman standing on the deck, singing the song that promised deliverance. The scene was chaotic and beautiful and desperate all at once. The soldiers moved to the second plantation, then the third, then the fourth. At each location, the pattern repeated. Fires, explosions, Harriet's voice singing in the darkness, and enslaved people running toward the river, hundreds of them, so many that the gunboats began to fill beyond capacity. By dawn, the raid was complete. The soldiers had destroyed 9 plantations, several bridges, multiple storehouses, and thousands of tons of rice and cotton. They had seized supplies and livestock, and they had liberated approximately 750 enslaved people, the largest emancipation event of the Civil War up to that point. The gunboats, overloaded with refugees, began the slow journey back downstream to Port Royal. Harriet stood on the deck and looked at the faces of the people crowded around her. Some were crying, some were singing. Some stood in stunned silence, unable to believe they were free. One woman clutched Harriet's hand and asked if it was real. Harriet squeezed her hand and said yes. It was real. They were free. They would never be slaves again. The Combahee River Raid made headlines across the North. Newspapers celebrated it as a major Union victory. But most of the articles credited Colonel Montgomery. Some mentioned the colored troops who had participated. A few mentioned that a black woman had served as a scout. Almost none mentioned Harriet Tubman by name. One notable exception was an article in the Commonwealth, a Boston abolitionist newspaper, published on July 10, 1863. It read, "Colonel Montgomery and his gallant band of 300 black soldiers, under the guidance of a black woman, dashed into the enemy's country, struck a bold and effective blow, destroying millions of dollars worth of commissary stores, cotton, and lordly dwellings, and striking terror into the heart of rebellion, brought off near 800 slaves and thousands of dollars worth of property." That article was one of the few contemporary accounts that acknowledged Harriet's role. But even that article did not fully convey what had happened. Harriet Tubman had not simply guided the raid, she had planned it. She had gathered the intelligence. She had recruited and trained the scouts. She had personally led the gunboats past the mines. She had been the voice that called the enslaved people to freedom. She had been, in every meaningful sense, the commander of the operation. She was the first woman in United States history to lead an armed military raid. But the United States Army did not acknowledge it. Not officially. Not then. The morning after the Combahee River Raid, Harriet Tubman stood on the dock at Port Royal and watched as 750 formerly enslaved people disembarked from the 3 gunboats. Some walked down the gangplanks with dignity, carrying bundles of possessions they had grabbed in the chaos of their escape. Others stumbled, weak from hunger and exhaustion. Mothers clutched infants. Children clung to their parents. Elderly men and women who had survived decades of slavery walked onto free soil for the first time in their lives. The dock was crowded with Union soldiers, Army officials, doctors, and members of the contraband relief societies, who had rushed to the harbor to witness what everyone was already calling the most successful liberation operation of the war. Harriet moved through the crowd, speaking quietly to the refugees, reassuring them, helping them find family members who had been separated in the confusion. She had torn her dress during the raid, ripped by desperate hands, as people had fought to board the overloaded gunboats. She had not slept in 36 hours. But she did not rest. These people needed help, and she would not stop until every one of them had food, shelter, and the beginnings of a new life. Within hours, the news of the Combahee River Raid began spreading across the Union. Newspapers from Boston to Washington, D.C. published accounts of the operation. The New York Tribune called it a daring and successful raid. The Commonwealth in Boston described it as a bold and effective blow against the rebellion. The reports emphasized the destruction of Confederate property. 9 plantations burned, multiple bridges destroyed, rice mills, cotton gins, and storehouses reduced to ashes. Supplies worth millions of dollars obliterated in a single night. The economic damage to the Confederacy was substantial. But the real victory was not measured in dollars or property. The real victory was standing on the docks of Port Royal. 750 human beings who had been enslaved that morning and were free by nightfall. The raid had liberated more people in one operation than Harriet had rescued in all her years on the Underground Railroad combined. It was the largest emancipation event of the Civil War up to that point, and it demonstrated something that many people in the Union had doubted. Black soldiers could fight, they could execute complex military operations, they could defeat Confederate forces, and they could liberate their own people. The men of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers returned from the raid as heroes within their regiment. Colonel Montgomery praised their discipline and courage. He noted in his official report that not a single Union soldier had been killed or seriously wounded during the operation, despite engaging Confederate pickets at multiple locations. The soldiers had executed their orders with precision. They had destroyed the targeted infrastructure. They had protected the refugees. They had returned safely. It was, by any military standard, a perfectly executed raid. But the official reports barely mentioned Harriet Tubman. Montgomery's report acknowledged that a black woman had served as a guide. Some newspaper accounts mentioned her by name, but none of them fully described her role. They did not mention that she had spent 2 weeks gathering the intelligence that made the raid possible. They did not mention that she had mapped the river, identified the mines, located the plantations, and coordinated with enslaved people to ensure they would be ready to escape when the gunboats arrived. They did not mention that she had stood on the deck of the lead gunboat and personally guided it through dangerous waters. They did not mention that her voice, singing in the darkness, had been the signal that brought 750 people running toward freedom. The black press understood what had happened. The African-American newspaper, the Weekly Anglo-African, published an article on July 10, 1863, that came closer to the truth. It described Harriet as the conductor on the Underground Railroad who had, with wonderful courage and generalship, organized the intelligence network that made the raid successful. The article noted that she had led the raid in person and had been the soul of the expedition. But even that article did not use the word that would have been accurate: commander. Harriet Tubman had commanded the Combahee River raid. She had planned it. She had executed it. She had made the critical decisions that ensured its success. She was, in every meaningful sense, a military officer. But the United States Army in 1863 did not have female officers. The idea was unthinkable. Women could serve as nurses. They could work as laundresses and cooks. They could even work as spies, though such work was never officially acknowledged. But they could not command troops. They could not lead military operations. So the Army found ways to describe Harriet's role that avoided acknowledging what she had actually done. She was a guide. She was a scout. She was someone who accompanied the troops. But she was not, according to official records, a commander. Harriet did not fight for recognition. She did not demand that the Army acknowledge her role. She had work to do. The 750 people liberated from the Combahee River plantations needed assistance. Many of them were sick. Some had been beaten by overseers as they fled. Children were separated from parents in the chaos. Harriet spent the weeks following the raid, helping to reunite families, coordinating with the relief societies to provide food and clothing, and working with Army recruiters to organize the able-bodied men into military units. Approximately 100 of the men liberated in the raid enlisted in the Union Army within days of their rescue. They joined the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, the same regiment that had freed them. Some would go on to fight in other raids along the coast. Some would march with Sherman's army through Georgia. Some would survive the war and live into the 20th century, telling their grandchildren about the night they heard a woman singing in the darkness, and ran toward freedom. But Harriet's work in South Carolina was not finished. The Combahee River Raid had demonstrated that large-scale liberation operations were possible. Union commanders wanted more. They wanted to continue disrupting the Confederate economy, freeing enslaved people, and recruiting soldiers. Harriet participated in at least 2 more operations during the summer of 1863, though the details are less well documented. In July, she accompanied Colonel Montgomery on a raid up the St. Mary's River into Georgia. That operation liberated approximately 100 more enslaved people and destroyed additional Confederate supplies. She continued to work as a scout and intelligence gatherer, sending her network of informants deeper into Confederate territory. By late summer 1863, Harriet's reputation within the Union Army was extraordinary. Officers who had initially dismissed her as just another contraband woman seeking employment now recognized her as one of the most effective intelligence operatives in the Department of the South. General Rufus Saxton, who commanded Union forces in South Carolina, wrote to his superiors praising Harriet's patriotism, sagacity, energy, and ability. He noted that she had made many a raid inside the enemy's lines, displaying remarkable courage, zeal, and fidelity. But despite that praise, Harriet was still paid as a cook. Her official salary from the Army was $20 per month, the same wage paid to black laundresses and kitchen workers. White male scouts and spies earned significantly more, sometimes hundreds of dollars per mission. Officers earned even more. Harriet's contributions were acknowledged informally, but they were not rewarded financially. The financial situation became untenable. Harriet had been supporting herself since arriving in South Carolina in 1862. She sent money to her parents in Auburn. She helped support other formerly enslaved people who had no resources. She purchased supplies for her scouting missions out of her own pocket. By late 1863, she was essentially broke. She wrote to friends in the North asking for assistance. She sold pies and gingerbread to soldiers to earn extra money. The situation was humiliating for someone who had risked her life repeatedly for the Union cause. But it was also typical. The Union Army routinely underpaid or failed to pay black soldiers, laborers, and civilians who worked for the military. White soldiers received $13 per month plus clothing allowances. Black soldiers initially received only $10 per month, minus $3 for clothing, leaving them with $7. After protests and lobbying by black soldiers and abolitionist allies, Congress equalized pay in 1864, but the damage had been done. Many black soldiers and civilians felt that the Union was exploiting them, using their labor and their courage while denying them fair compensation. Harriet continued working despite the financial struggles. In early 1864, she returned to nursing, caring for soldiers at the Contraband Hospital in Beaufort. She had developed her own remedies for dysentery, a disease that killed more soldiers than combat during the Civil War. She brewed medicines from roots and herbs, using knowledge passed down from her mother, and expanded through her own experimentation. Soldiers who had been given up for dead recovered under her care. One officer wrote that Harriet Tubman had done more good than all the doctors put together. But nursing did not pay any better than cooking. By mid-1864, Harriet was exhausted, ill, and financially desperate. She decided to return to Auburn to rest and to care for her aging parents. She left South Carolina in October 1864, nearly 2.5 years after arriving. She had participated in dozens of military operations. She had helped liberate more than 800 people from slavery. She had proven that women could serve in combat roles, that black soldiers could fight effectively, and that intelligence operations were crucial to military success. But when she left, she had almost no money. She had no official recognition, and she had no indication that the United States government would ever compensate her for her service. The war continued without her. General William Tecumseh Sherman began his march to the sea in November 1864, cutting a path of destruction through Georgia. The 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, the regiment Harriet had worked with during the Combahee River Raid, marched with Sherman's army. They participated in some of the final battles of the war. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederacy collapsed. Slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865. The war was over. 4 million enslaved people were free. And Harriet Tubman, who had done as much as anyone to bring about that freedom, went home to Auburn, New York, and tried to build a quiet life. She married a man named Nelson Davis in 1869. He was a black Union Army veteran, 22 years younger than her, who had been injured during the war and suffered from tuberculosis. Harriet cared for him until his death in 1888. She opened a home for elderly and indigent black people on her property. She became active in the women's suffrage movement, speaking at conventions alongside Susan B. Anthony and other leaders. She told her story to audiences across the North, not to glorify herself, but to honor the people who had fought for freedom. But financially, she struggled for the rest of her life. In 1867, she applied for a military pension based on her service during the Civil War. The application was denied. The Army claimed that she had been a volunteer, not an official soldier, and therefore was not entitled to a pension. She appealed multiple times. She submitted letters from Union officers attesting to her service. General Saxton wrote a testimonial. Colonel Montgomery confirmed her role in the Combahee River Raid. Nothing worked. The bureaucracy was immovable. Finally, in 1890, after decades of appeals, Congress passed a special act granting Harriet a pension. But it was not a military pension. It was a widow's pension, based on her deceased husband Nelson Davis's service as a soldier. The pension was $8 per month, a fraction of what white veterans received. It was an insult, but it was all she would get. In 1899, at age 77, Harriet made one final attempt to secure recognition for her own military service. She applied again for a military pension based on her work as a scout and nurse. This time she included more documentation. Affidavits from people who had witnessed her service, copies of military orders, letters from officers. The application wound its way through Congress for several years. In 1902, the government finally agreed to increase her pension. But again, it was based on her status as a widow, not as a veteran. The new amount was $20 per month. Harriet accepted it. She was 80 years old. She needed the money. But she never stopped trying to correct the record. She wanted history to remember what she had done, not for glory, but so that the 750 people she had led to freedom on the Combahee River would know that their liberation had not been an accident. It had been planned. It had been executed by someone who cared about them, and that someone had been a black woman named Harriet Tubman. When Harriet Tubman returned to Auburn, New York, in October 1864, she was 42 years old and completely exhausted. She had spent nearly 3 years in South Carolina working for the Union Army as a nurse, scout, spy, and military strategist. She had participated in dozens of military operations. She had helped liberate more than 800 people from slavery. She had proven beyond any doubt that black women could serve in combat roles, could lead military operations, and could contribute to the Union war effort in ways that few people had imagined possible. But when she stepped off the train in Auburn, she had exactly nothing to show for it. No pension, no official recognition, no back pay for the months when the Army had failed to pay her salary. She had $5 in her pocket. She walked the 3 miles from the train station to the small house on South Street where her parents lived. The house she had purchased for them in 1859 with money she had saved from her work on the Underground Railroad. Her mother, Harriet Green Ross, who was now in her 70s, opened the door and pulled her daughter into her arms. She did not ask about the war. She did not ask about South Carolina. She simply held her daughter and said, "You are home now. Rest." But rest did not come easily. Harriet had always suffered from the sleeping spells and vivid dreams caused by the traumatic brain injury she had sustained as a child. The injury had never healed. Throughout her life, she would suddenly fall asleep without warning, sometimes in the middle of conversations, sometimes while standing. The episodes lasted anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes. When she woke, she would often report having visions, dreams that felt more real than waking life. She interpreted these experiences as communications from God, divine messages that guided her actions. During the war, the sleeping spells had become more frequent, likely exacerbated by exhaustion, stress, and poor nutrition. Now, back in Auburn, they became worse. She would wake in the night screaming, reliving the Combahee River raid, hearing the explosions, smelling the smoke, seeing the faces of the people running toward the gunboats. Her mother would find her sitting upright in bed, drenched in sweat, whispering the names of people she had tried to save. The war had ended for most Americans in April 1865 when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. But for Harriet, the war would never truly end. She carried it with her every day for the rest of her life. Financial survival became her immediate concern. She had no income. She applied for employment with several local families, offering to work as a cook or housekeeper. Some hired her, some refused, uncomfortable with the idea of hiring someone as famous as Harriet Tubman to do domestic work. She sold vegetables from a small garden she cultivated on her property. She took in laundry. She baked pies and sold them door to door. It was humiliating work for someone who had commanded military operations. But Harriet did what she had always done. She survived. In 1867, she decided to apply for a military pension. The process seemed straightforward. She had served the Union Army for nearly 3 years. She had documentation: letters from officers, testimonials from soldiers, copies of military orders. She submitted her application to the Bureau of Pensions in Washington, D.C., and waited. Months passed, then a year. Finally, in 1868, she received a response. Her application had been denied. The reason given was that she had been a volunteer, not an enlisted soldier, and therefore was not entitled to a pension under existing laws. Harriet was devastated. She had never formally enlisted because the Army did not allow women to enlist. She had served because she believed it was the right thing to do. And now the government was punishing her for that service. She did not give up. She appealed the decision. She wrote letters to her contacts in Congress. She reached out to abolitionists who had supported her during the war. Frederick Douglass wrote a letter on her behalf, describing her service as more meritorious than that of many men who receive a pension. General Rufus Saxton submitted an affidavit confirming that Harriet had served as a scout and spy under his command. Colonel James Montgomery testified that she had been instrumental in planning and executing the Combahee River raid. None of it mattered. The bureaucracy was immovable. The Bureau of Pensions responded that without formal enlistment records, they could not process her application. Harriet asked how she could have enlistment records when the Army did not enlist women. The Bureau had no answer. The denials continued year after year. 1870, 1875, 1880. Each time, Harriet resubmitted her application with more documentation, more testimonials, more evidence of her service. Each time, she was denied for the same reason. She was not an enlisted soldier, therefore she was not entitled to a pension. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on anyone who understood what had happened. Harriet Tubman had done more for the Union cause than most enlisted soldiers. But because the system had prevented her from enlisting formally, that same system now refused to compensate her for her service. During this period, Harriet married Nelson Davis in 1869. He was 22 years younger than her, a black man who had served in the 8th United States Colored Infantry during the war. He had been injured in combat and suffered from tuberculosis, a disease that would eventually kill him. Harriet cared for him throughout their marriage, nursing him as his health deteriorated. They had no biological children, but Harriet adopted a daughter, Gertie Davis, who had been born to a woman Harriet knew in Auburn. Harriet raised Gertie as her own, providing the child with education and opportunities that Harriet herself had never had. Nelson Davis died in 1888. Harriet was 66 years old, a widow, and still without a pension. But Davis's death created an unexpected opportunity. Because he had been an enlisted soldier, Harriet was entitled to apply for a widow's pension based on his military service. She submitted the application immediately. This time, it was approved. In 1890, Congress granted Harriet Tubman a pension of $8 per month as the widow of Nelson Davis. $8. It was an insult. White widows of Union soldiers received significantly more, but it was money, and Harriet needed money desperately. She accepted the pension and continued advocating for recognition of her own military service. The fight for her own pension became a cause célèbre among abolitionists and women's rights activists. Susan B. Anthony, whom Harriet had met at suffrage conventions in the 1880s, took up the cause. She lobbied members of Congress. She wrote articles in women's rights publications. She organized petitions. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, another prominent suffragist, joined the effort. These women understood that Harriet's fight was about more than money. It was about recognition. It was about acknowledging that women had served in the Civil War, that black women had contributed to Union victory, and that those contributions deserved the same respect and compensation given to white male soldiers. The campaign gained momentum in the 1890s. Newspapers published articles about Harriet's service. Veterans organizations sent letters of support. In 1899, after more than 3 decades of denials, Congress finally agreed to reconsider Harriet's application. The hearing process took 3 years. Witnesses testified. Documents were reviewed. Military records were examined. In 1902, Congress passed a special act granting Harriet Tubman an increased pension. But once again, it was not a military pension. It was an increase to her widow's pension, raising it from $8 per month to $20 per month. The language of the act carefully avoided acknowledging Harriet's own service. It described the increase as compensation for her work as a nurse during the war, not as a scout, spy, or military commander. It was progress, but it was not justice. Harriet used the increased pension to pursue a project she had been planning for years. She wanted to establish a home for elderly and indigent black people in Auburn. She had seen too many formerly enslaved people die alone and forgotten, with no family to care for them and no resources to support themselves in old age. In 1896, she purchased 25 acres of land adjacent to her home. She raised money through speaking engagements and donations from supporters. In 1908, she donated the land to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, with the stipulation that it be used to establish the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged. The home opened in 1908. Harriet personally cared for residents, cooking meals, tending to the sick, and providing companionship to people who had nowhere else to go. She was in her 80s, suffering from her own health problems, but she continued working. She had spent her entire life caring for others. She did not know how to stop. The home became her legacy, a tangible expression of the values she had lived by. Freedom was not just about escaping slavery. It was about building communities where people could live with dignity. It was about ensuring that those who had suffered under slavery would not suffer again in freedom. Harriet also became involved in the women's suffrage movement. She attended conventions in Rochester, Boston, and Washington, D.C. She spoke about her experiences as a black woman fighting for freedom. She argued that if black men had earned the right to vote through their service in the Civil War, then women, who had also served, deserved the same right. Her speeches were powerful. She did not use flowery language or sophisticated rhetoric. She spoke plainly about justice, about the absurdity of denying half the population the right to participate in democracy. Susan B. Anthony called Harriet one of our greatest Americans. But even within the suffrage movement, Harriet faced discrimination. Some white suffragists did not want black women speaking at their conventions, fearing it would alienate Southern supporters. Harriet ignored them. She spoke when and where she wanted. She made it clear that the fight for women's rights could not be separated from the fight for racial justice. The two were intertwined. Any movement that did not recognize that fact was doomed to failure. By 1910, Harriet's health was deteriorating rapidly. The sleeping spells had become more severe. She suffered from chronic pain in her head, likely related to the childhood injury that had never properly healed. She underwent brain surgery in 1898, performed without anesthesia because she refused it, choosing instead to bite down on a bullet, as she had seen soldiers do during the war. The surgery provided some relief, but the pain returned within a few years. She developed pneumonia repeatedly. Her eyesight failed. She could no longer read or write, though she had never been fully literate. By 1911, she could no longer care for herself. The same home she had established for elderly black people became her residence. She moved into a room at the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged and received the same care she had provided to so many others. She died there on March 10, 1913. She was 91 years old. Her funeral was held at the Thompson AME Zion Church in Auburn. Hundreds of people attended. Veterans from the Civil War marched in formation. Members of women's suffrage organizations carried banners. The mayor of Auburn gave a eulogy. but the United States government did not send a representative. The Army did not acknowledge her death. No official recognition was given to the woman who had led the largest emancipation operation in American history. Harriet Tubman was buried at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn with military honors, organized not by the government, but by local veterans who believed she deserved them. A bugler played taps. An American flag was draped over her coffin. The veterans who attended the funeral understood what the government refused to acknowledge. Harriet Tubman had been a soldier. She had served with courage and distinction. She had led troops into battle. She had saved lives. She had changed the course of American history. And she had died without ever receiving the recognition she deserved. In the decades following her death, Harriet Tubman's story began to fade from public memory. History textbooks mentioned her briefly as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Some mentioned her work during the Civil War, but the full scope of her accomplishments, particularly her role as a military commander, was forgotten or minimized. The Combahee River Raid was attributed to Colonel Montgomery. The intelligence network she built in South Carolina was credited to unnamed scouts. Her role in planning and executing military operations was erased from official records. By the 1950s, most Americans knew Harriet Tubman's name, but few understood what she had actually done. She had become a symbol, a simplified narrative of courage and freedom. But the complexity of her life, the full measure of her contributions, had been lost. For decades after Harriet Tubman's death in 1913, her story existed in a strange limbo between memory and mythology. Every American schoolchild learned her name. Textbooks mentioned her as a heroic figure who helped slaves escape to freedom. But the details were vague, simplified, often inaccurate. She was described as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a term that suggested she merely guided people along pre-existing routes, rather than creating and commanding a sophisticated network of liberation. Her military service during the Civil War was barely mentioned. The Combahee River Raid, the largest emancipation operation in American history, was attributed to Colonel James Montgomery in most historical accounts. Harriet's name appeared as a footnote, if it appeared at all. The intelligence network she had built, the reconnaissance missions she had led, the strategic planning she had done, all of it was forgotten or deliberately erased. By the 1920s and 1930s, Harriet Tubman had become a symbol rather than a person. She represented courage and determination in the abstract. But the specifics of what she had accomplished, the full measure of her genius and bravery, had been lost. The first serious attempt to recover Harriet's true story came in 1943, when Earl Conrad, a white journalist and historian, published Harriet Tubman, Negro Soldier and Abolitionist. Conrad had spent years researching Harriet's life, tracking down military records, interviewing descendants of people she had rescued, and piecing together documentation that had been scattered across archives throughout the Northeast. His book was the first to seriously examine Harriet's role during the Civil War. He documented her work as a scout and spy. He identified her role in planning the Combahee River Raid. He calculated that she had participated in at least 8 military operations between 1862 and 1864. His research was groundbreaking, but the book sold poorly. In 1943, America was focused on World War II. A biography of a black woman who had died 30 years earlier did not capture public attention. Conrad's work was largely forgotten. It would take another generation before historians would rediscover what he had uncovered. Through the 1950s and 1960s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, interest in Black history began to grow. Scholars started examining the contributions of African Americans to American history, contributions that had been systematically minimized or erased from mainstream narratives. Harriet Tubman's name appeared more frequently in these new histories, but the focus remained on the Underground Railroad. Her military service was still barely acknowledged. The turning point came in 1974 when historian Jean Humez published an article in the journal Signs titled Harriet Tubman, The Life and the Life Stories. Humez argued that previous biographies of Tubman had romanticized her story, while simultaneously diminishing her agency and intelligence. Humez analyzed the primary sources, the letters Harriet had dictated, the testimony she had given, the military records that documented her service. She concluded that Harriet Tubman had been the most important Black woman in 19th century American history, and that her contributions, particularly during the Civil War, had been systematically erased by historians who could not accept that a Black woman had commanded military operations. Humez's article sparked a wave of new research. Historians began digging deeper into military archives. They found documents that had been misfiled or deliberately buried. They discovered correspondence between Union generals discussing the woman scout who was providing crucial intelligence. They found payment records showing that Harriet had been paid as a spy, not just as a nurse. They found after-action reports from the Combahee River raid that mentioned her by name. The evidence was overwhelming. Harriet Tubman had not simply accompanied military operations. She had led them. In 1985, historian Kate Clifford Larson began work on what would become the definitive biography of Harriet Tubman. Larson spent nearly 20 years researching. She tracked down descendants of people Harriet had rescued. She examined land records, census data, church records, and personal letters. She traveled to Maryland to walk the routes Harriet had used on the Underground Railroad. She went to South Carolina to visit the sites of the plantations that had been destroyed during the Combahee River raid. Her biography, published in 2004 as Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero, was the most comprehensive account of Harriet's life ever written. Larson documented everything: the 13 rescue missions, the 70 people personally liberated, the intelligence network in South Carolina, the role in planning military operations, the decades-long fight for a military pension, the establishment of the Home for the Aged. Larson's book was acclaimed by historians and became required reading in universities across America. But even with this new scholarship, full recognition remained elusive. The general public still knew Harriet primarily as an Underground Railroad conductor. Her military service remained obscure. That began to change in the 2010s. In 2016, the United States Treasury Department announced that Harriet Tubman would replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. The decision was historic. Harriet would become the first Black woman and the first woman in more than a century to appear on American currency. The announcement sparked intense public interest in Harriet's life. News organizations published articles examining her accomplishments. Documentary filmmakers produced programs about her. Schools updated their curricula. For the first time in more than a century, millions of Americans began learning the full story of what Harriet Tubman had actually done. They learned about the Combahee River raid. They learned about her work as a military scout and spy. They learned about the intelligence network she had built. They learned about the pension fight that had lasted decades. And they learned about the systemic erasure of her accomplishments from official histories. The reaction was powerful. Veterans organizations began lobbying for Harriet to receive official military recognition. Historians published op-eds arguing that she deserved retroactive promotion to general. Members of Congress introduced bills to formally acknowledge her military service. But the $20 bill faced delays. The Treasury Department, under different political leadership, postponed the redesign. Officials claimed technical difficulties. Critics argued that the real reason was discomfort with honoring a black woman who had fought against slavery and for women's rights. As of 2024, the Harriet Tubman $20 bill has still not been issued. The current plan is for introduction in 2030, more than a decade after the original announcement. The delay has become a symbol of America's ongoing struggle to fully acknowledge black women's contributions to American history. But even without the currency redesign, Harriet's story has been reclaimed. In 2017, the National Park Service opened the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park in Maryland. The park preserves landscapes Harriet traveled through during her escapes and rescue missions. Visitors can walk paths she walked. They can see the Choptank River she crossed under cover of darkness. They can visit the site of the plantation where she was born into slavery. The park has become one of the most visited National Park Service sites in the Mid-Atlantic region. Tens of thousands of people visit each year, learning about Harriet's life and legacy. In 2020, scholars at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., mounted a major exhibition titled Harriet Tubman, A Journey to Freedom. The exhibition included artifacts from Harriet's life, documents from the Combahee River Raid, and interactive displays allowing visitors to experience the choices Harriet faced during her rescue missions. The exhibition attracted more than 200,000 visitors in its first year. Educational materials from the exhibition were distributed to schools nationwide. For the first time, an entire generation of American students learned about Harriet not as a simplified symbol, but as a complex, brilliant, courageous woman who had changed history. In November 2024, on Veterans Day, the United States Army finally took a step toward formal recognition. At a ceremony at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, renamed Fort Liberty after the removal of Confederate namesakes, the Army posthumously promoted Harriet Tubman to the rank of Brigadier General. It was an honorary promotion, more symbolic than substantive, but it mattered. A military spokesperson read a statement acknowledging that Harriet had served with distinction as a scout, spy, and military leader during the Civil War, and that her contributions had been unjustly minimized for more than 150 years. The ceremony was attended by Harriet's descendants, including several great-great-great-grandchildren who had traveled from across the country to witness the recognition their ancestor deserved. But perhaps the most important development in recent years has been the scholarly work to document the impact of Harriet's rescues across generations. Historians and genealogists have been tracking the descendants of the people Harriet liberated. The 70 people she personally guided to freedom on the Underground Railroad. The approximately 750 people freed during the Combahee River Raid. The hundreds more who escaped slavery because of intelligence she provided and routes she mapped. Those people had children. Those children had children. Generations have lived in freedom because of decisions Harriet made between 1849 and 1863. Genealogists estimate that Harriet's direct rescues have resulted in approximately 50,000 living descendants as of 2024. 50,000 people who exist because one woman decided that freedom was worth risking everything. Many of these descendants have no idea they are connected to Harriet Tubman. The family histories were lost, obscured by time and migration. But research organizations have been working to identify connections, DNA databases, church records, census data. Slowly, the web of connections is being reconstructed. Families are discovering that their ancestors were among the people standing on the docks at Port Royal on June 3, 1863. Some have found letters and documents passed down through generations, references to Moses, who came in the night and led them to freedom. These discoveries have profound emotional impact. Descendants speak of feeling connected to something larger than themselves, understanding that their very existence is the result of extraordinary courage. This work of historical recovery continues. In 2023, researchers at the National Archives discovered a cache of previously unknown documents related to Harriet's pension applications. Among them were letters written by Union officers who had served with her, testimony that had been submitted but apparently ignored by the Bureau of Pensions. One letter, written by Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, commander of another black regiment in South Carolina, described Harriet as the most remarkable woman I have ever known, combining the shrewdness of a detective, the courage of a soldier, and the compassion of a nurse. Another letter from General David Hunter stated explicitly that Harriet had planned and directed military operations with a skill that would have been creditable to any officer in the service. These letters had been in the archives for more than 100 years. No one had read them. No one had acted on them. They had simply been filed away, forgotten. Their rediscovery has provided additional evidence of what historians have been arguing for decades. Harriet Tubman was not simply a helper or a guide. She was a military commander. She was a strategic thinker. She was, in every meaningful sense, a general. The United States government refused to acknowledge that fact during her lifetime. It took more than 100 years after her death for that acknowledgement to begin. As of 2024, Harriet Tubman's legacy is being actively reclaimed and celebrated in ways that would have seemed impossible even 20 years ago. Schools, libraries, and museums across America bear her name. Statues have been erected in Auburn, New York, Cambridge, Maryland, and other locations connected to her life. In 2023, the state of Maryland dedicated the Harriet Tubman Memorial Garden in Baltimore, a site where visitors can reflect on her life and contributions. The garden includes 750 white roses, one for each person freed during the Combahee River Raid. It has become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking to understand American history and to honor those who fought for freedom. But the most fitting tribute to Harriet Tubman is not a statue or a garden, or even a place on currency. It is the fact that her story is finally being told truthfully. For generations, American history minimized Black women's contributions. It erased their names from the historical record. It reduced complex, brilliant, courageous women to footnotes or symbols. Harriet Tubman's story was almost lost to that erasure. But it has been recovered. And in recovering her story, we have recovered something essential about who we are as a nation. We have acknowledged that freedom was not given. It was fought for. It was earned through courage, sacrifice, and unimaginable risks. And some of the most important fighters in that struggle were black women who refused to accept the limits others tried to impose on them. Harriet Tubman lived for 91 years. She spent 64 of those years working for freedom. First her own freedom, then the freedom of others. She never stopped. She never gave up. And now, more than 100 years after her death, the debt we owe her is finally beginning to be paid.